family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, geography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We've got lots to cover in the next couple of hours, so I hope you'll stay with us, because we certainly will not only be talking about some of the issues in the news, but Larry Elder will be with us next hour. We'll be talking about his new book, but I'm sure he'll have a few comments to make about Maxine Waters if he has time to do so. And in the third hour, which again you can listen to online or watch online, we have Steve and Jackie Green with us, This Dangerous Book. You know them from Hobby Lobby, and we're going to be talking about the Bible, talking about the Museum of the Bible, and so it's just going to be great material. But we, of course, have had a number of incidents unfold over the weekend, and let me give you my conclusion before we even get into it, so maybe that helps you understand how we get there, and that is any establishment, I believe, has a right to refuse service for a variety of different reasons to their customers. Those individuals who are customers who have been refused that service don't have to go and sue. They have a right to complain about it on social media, and there's nothing wrong with that as well. And those individuals that even want to protest an individual have that right, although I think it's really bad form. And my argument is that leading officials, whether it's members of Congress or cabinet officers or others, would do well right now to try to tamp down what is beginning to escalate into something that could end up in violence. You know, say like shooting Republican members of Congress at a baseball field or something like that. So if you want to know how we get there, it has to do with how Sarah Huckabee Sanders was treated over the weekend, how a variety of other individuals in the cabinet have been treated. I'm thinking in particular about Kirstjen Nielsen and Stephen Miller, but I'm going to give you a longer list than even that. It also relates, of course, to the decision that came down from the Supreme Court related to Jack Phillips, who is the baker in Colorado, and the decision that came down today in which the justices of the Supreme Court vacated the decision against Baronel Stutzman of Arlene's Flowers, but sent it back to Washington, and I think it'll come back again. But we'll see where that all takes us. And, of course, then the tremendous number of protests that have been taking place and the possible implication of all of that. So that is a lot to cover. But let me, before I get any further, also mention that this is the last week before the end of our fiscal year. I will tell you that probably the most important week in our year is the very last week of the calendar year, which is in December. But the second most important week is this week, and that is the last week before the end of our fiscal year, because it helps us tremendously if we can end this particular ministry's budget in the black. We have a very lean budget. We only have a few staff. Listening for a while, either in the Dallas area or the Minnesota area, since this is the first hour where we're only on a few small stations before. If you can help us out financially, that would be greatly appreciated. You, of course, can go to our website, which says donate. And a little bit later, I'll share some stories about individuals that have been positively influenced by this program. But also, anywhere along the way, if you'd like to make a gift, and you can do this off air. You don't have to come on air. This is a different number. It's 800-347-5151. I'll spend some time a little bit later talking about that, but I just wanted to alert you to the fact that it is our last week before the end of the fiscal year. On our website, you'll see one of the articles I've posted actually is from the Washington Post, because I wanted you to hear how kind of the liberal press covered it. And then also didn't show up in the story, either because they did not know it or because they didn't think they were relevant. But nevertheless, that's the case. And that is, you had a situation in Lexington, Virginia, which is in the Washington, D.C. area, so I kind of know where some of this is. And the chef of the Red Hen, which is kind of a farm-to-table restaurant there in Lexington, Virginia, got a call around 8 p.m., and somebody said Sarah Huckabee Sanders has walked in with some other people, and the staff are very concerned. And so came down just to see if it was true, and lo and behold, there it was, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And so then it was like, okay, what am I going to do? She expressed the fact that she felt that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is the service of inhumane and unethical administration, so you can read all of that. And she also said, I'm not really a huge fan of confrontation. That's what she says. I'm going to add something that's not in the Washington Post article, but nevertheless, she my other employees in the Red Hen and said, what do you want me to do? And she said, I can ask her to leave, and they said yes. So the decision was that the staff there at the Red Hen in Lexington, Virginia, wanted her to go then ask Sarah Huckabee Sanders to leave. Now, she does point out something very interesting. Lexington has a population of about 7,000, and they voted overwhelmingly against Donald Trump because it's become kind of an enclave for some of the liberal progressives. They've moved down from New York and other places. But the county itself voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. Blue dot in the midst of red, because, you know, that's just the way that county is. It's primarily people in the rural area are voting for Donald Trump in record numbers, at least last time. But those in that particular town actually tend to be very anti-Trump. And, of course, the people at the restaurant that were the staff also were that way. So she said, I came up, and I'm just going to read what it says here. I came up, I said, I'm the owner, she recalled. I'd like you to come out to the patio with me for a word. They stepped outside into another small enclosure, but at least out of the crowded restaurant. This is where Stephanie says, I was babbling a little bit, but I got my point across in a polite and direct fashion. I explained that the restaurant has certain standards that I felt it has to uphold, such as honesty, compassion, and cooperation. And I said, I'd like to ask you to leave. And Sarah Sanders' response was, that's fine, I will go. And since they had already had a cheese plate on the table, they offered to pay, but Stephanie Wilkerson said, no, it's on the house. And so at that point, it could have just ended, but then social media takes over. And I would have to say that the one that most people have been talking about was the post that came from Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Well, I'll just read it in its entirety. Last night, I was told by the owner of Red Hen in Lexington, Virginia, leave because I work for the President of the United States. I politely left. Her actions say more about her than about me. I always do my best to treat people, including those I disagree with, respectfully, and will continue to do so. Now, some people complained that she posted the name Red Hen, but that was already out on the social media, so it wasn't like she was revealing that for the first time, but we'll leave that as it is. Since we're coming to a break, let me mention what is not in the article. And again, I don't know if the people writing for the Washington Post did not know it or just didn't think it was relevant. But Sarah Huckabee Sanders is the daughter of Mike Huckabee. He didn't bother to leave out some of the details, one of which was as they decided to go across the street to another restaurant, the owner followed them along and kept kind of hectoring them and criticizing them and making a scene. And so that sort of ended up there. So, again, she may say, I don't like confrontation, but once she had a chance to tell Miss Sanders Huckabee where to go, Huckabee Sanders where to go, then obviously she decided to keep that up as they even went across the street. So it is one incident, but when we come back, I want to talk about many of the others, because if this was a one-off, a lot of people go, okay, as I've said before, you have a right as a restaurant to say, or I just don't like the way you look, we're not going to serve you, or I don't even like how you vote. But there's a lot more. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This summer, we will certainly hear that the warmer temperatures demonstrate that we are headed for a climate doomsday. That is why Vijay Jairaj wrote an article with the provocative title, Why Climate Doomsday Won't Happen This Summer. I suppose his predictions could be as accurate as any of the others we've heard. He has 4 points. First, the world just experienced one of its coldest recorded winters in history. Cities like New York registered record snowfall. Many cities in the U.S. and Canada broke 80-year record lows, and even the U.K. experienced snowy conditions well into spring. He is quick to acknowledge that a cold winter doesn't guarantee a mild summer, but he believes that we might at least remind ourselves that global temperatures have not been increasing in the way we've been warned in the media. Second, global average temperature is rising, but it isn't even as close to the rate claimed by climate alarmists. At the very least, it would suggest that the climate computer models are missing key data and information. If the models don't model reality, something must be off. At least that was the conclusion we reached when I was in graduate school doing computer models and simulations. Third, carbon dioxide emissions are not the primary driver of global temperatures. The last 2 decades constituted the highest increase in carbon dioxide, yet the rate of global temperatures was lower than in previous decades. And finally, the Arctic and Antarctic ice masses are stable. Alarmists talk about the Arctic melting because the Antarctic ice mass is increasing. In fact, even the Arctic mass is stable, and it's worth mentioning that the polar bear populations are stable. These are just a few facts to remember the next time you hear someone in the media predicting an imminent climate doomsday. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking, of course, about what already has happened to Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And she says, I like to always treat people the best I can, even if I disagree with them. And Stephanie Wilkinson, who is the owner, wanted to have her leave, and that is just fine. And let me just say that some people say, well, you cannot discriminate. Yes, you can. We discriminate right now against individuals that come into a restaurant that pose a health hazard. That is certainly allowable. But you say, well, we can't discriminate against people on the basis of their religious experience, their ethnic background, of course, now even sexual orientation. Even if you accept all that, and I will come back to that in just a minute, we do have a number of precedents that say you can discriminate based on a person's political discrimination. Let me just pick one example. Back in April, there was a judge that rejected a lawsuit. This was a man who was wearing one of those hats. You know what I'm talking about. Make America Great Again. Wears a Make America Great hat into a New York City bar, and he was refused service, and the judge stated that the law does not protect political discrimination. So the reality is, at least according to that judge and according to New York City and probably a lot of other venues, that's not even going to have standing for the lawsuit. You see the point? Now, again, I come back to the point that we certainly at one time needed some of these public accommodation laws and discrimination laws because there was a fair amount of segregation and discrimination taking place. Has all of that gone? No, there's probably some of it around. But the reality is now, because of the way the culture has changed so much, do you honestly think that if there was a restaurant that really was racist, that it would stay into business very long in light of social media?
look at the reaction that took place, as we pointed out just a few days ago, and I've talked about on the various commentaries, and I have a commentary coming out next week on Starbucks. I mean, this is not a racist organization, and look at the protest outside of that because of one bad decision by an individual in that particular establishment. So the point I'm making is that I think now social shaming, ostracization, social media, that doesn't require that we have the heavy hand of government in here. And to her credit, Sarah Huckabee Sanders didn't say, you know what, I'm going to sue them. I'm going to get the government, fine them $130,000 and drive them out of business, which is what, of course, happened to Aaron and Melissa Klein in Oregon, and also happened up until recently, and we'll get to this in just a minute, the Supreme Court decision not to decide, but to vacate a ruling against Barronelle Stutzman. But let's recognize that this is beginning to heat up. And there certainly is a freedom that people have to protest individuals, but they don't have a freedom to threaten their lives. They don't have a freedom to inhibit their liberty or their access to a restaurant. And it's starting to get a little bit out of hand. And the two examples I'll use from the cabinet, and then I'm going to give you some others, have to do with the Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and then White House Senior Advisor Stephen Miller. And you had Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was swarmed by protesters in Washington, D.C. last week, and the restaurant took no action. Not upset the protesters came here, and we're not upset even if any of our staffers who tipped off the protesters actually did that. We are happy about what happened. And so you're starting to see that some of these protests are showing up at these restaurants, showing up at individuals that are being heckled, and both Kirstjen Nielsen and Stephen Miller were heckled. One step further, people are giving out, for example, the cell phone number of Stephen Miller so that you can call him. And so you're starting to see some of that unfolding as well. Let me just give you a few more examples here. Again, this one comes from, I think, a rather extensive survey of some of those. For example, what was being chanted at that Mexican restaurant? Kirstjen Nielsen, you're a villain, locking up immigrant children, and some of those kinds of things. Then they had a protest, not just activists then played audio of a crying infant saying no justice, no sleep. So they tried to actually violate, I think at this point, I think the police could have stepped in with a noise violation, but nevertheless did not. Again, a protester chased Stephen Miller out of a Mexican restaurant, accusing him of being racist. And as we pointed out here, one of these groups published his personal cell phone number to the public. And then the one that I've been sort of paying attention to more recently has to do with what happened to Pam Bondi. Now, Pam Bondi is not a member of the Trump cabinet. She's actually the Attorney General of the state of Florida. But she also received a very hostile reception at this and just went to the documentary. And maybe you've been hearing about this. It's been a fascinating documentary all about Mr. Rogers. And so, again, it was an attempt to try to simply go to this particular event, but then it got quickly out of hand, and they began yelling at her and shaming her in a number of... I've misplaced it at the moment, where later some of the activists said, well, that's not happening, and here's the video. And she went back and said, well, that's the video that was taken when we left the theater, when the police were there and everybody was on their good behavior. That's not the video that you could have taken when we had people shouting at us. One person spit into my hair, whether it was intentional or just accidental. And so, again, that is an issue. And then you have a university professor that's now created a 100 immigration and custom enforcement employees' personal information so that you can call up and harass some of the ICE individuals. And then one that I've talked about in the past, where you have the Ajit Pai, who actually has indeed had all sorts of threats at his home, where activists have come there as well, posted information about the names of their children, and said they will come to know the truth. Dad murdered democracy in cold blood, informing Pi that it was not too late for him to change his mind about net neutrality. And I love what Anjit Pai said. He said, I understand that people are passionate about policy, but it's one thing in America that should remain sacred, and that is families, wives, and kids should remain out of it and stop harassing us at our home to deal with that. And so the issues go on and on. I can make the list of, for example, the fake blood thrown on the private home of an NRA lobbyist, how Ivanka Trump was harassed on a flight, a man who had beer dumped beer on a lawmaker in a bar. And, of course, another guy in Miami, this is an African-American, goes into the Cheesecake Factory. He's got a Make America Great hat, and he receives all sorts of incredible responses as well. So in the midst of that, you would hope for some responsible action from our elected officials. And instead, Maxine Waters says, if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a downtown store, at a gas station, you get out and create a crowd, you push back on them, tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. And you got to wonder where this might end up in the future. So if nothing else, one of the things I wanted us to understand is that some of these very dangerous actions do have potential consequences. And so when we come back from the break, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about certainly how we can respond to that. But also, as I mentioned, this is a time in which we find ourselves in need of your financial support. So if you, even today, have heard some things maybe you haven't heard before, and if you appreciate the kinds of interviews and conversation that we have, I hope that you'll consider what you might do to support this ministry. We come back from the break, we're going to listen to a short piece from Lori Miller, because she's an individual that was listening to Point of View a number of years ago, and she learned about this particular sex education book that was really graphic called It's Perfectly Normal. And I'd written about this, and she was thinking, that's probably a little overdone, but let me even see if it's in my daughter's school library. And she went in and found the book and found a companion book next to it, opened it up, and she was appalled at how graphic the sexual content was. And so then she went out to the librarian and, first of all, had concerns that the book was in the library, but then wanted to find out if indeed her daughter had checked out the book. And the librarian said, well, that's private. I mean, she has privacy rights. And I love Lori saying, no, she's my daughter. She has no privacy rights. I want to see whether or not she's checked out this book, and I'd like to see how many other kids have been reading some of this graphic sexuality. So it's just an illustration, again, that as we talk about some of these issues here on Point of View, it does make a difference. It changes behaviors. And all through this week, I want to spend some time telling some of the stories that you have told us about how the information and the encouragement and empowerment we've provided have helped you make a difference in your community. So again, if you'd like to join with us, I hope that you might consider what kind of gift you'd like to give. And you could even join with us right now by going to the website, pointofview.net, or you can give us a call, 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151.
Ronnie fixes cars in a shop on his property. That allows him to earn a living for his family and be home to help care for Michael. Ronnie and Judy adopted Michael more than 20 years ago, knowing he would never walk or be able to care for himself. But through listening to Point of View, they were convicted that every life God gives is precious. So even though Ronnie is now 69 and Judy can't lift Michael anymore, every day is a labor of love and a testimony to their faith. Providing for their family isn't easy, and yet every month for almost 15 years, they've invested in Point of View. Some listeners have changed their communities and the nation. Ronnie and Judy changed everything for Michael. Your gift to Point of View in June is an investment in changed lives, and a matching challenge provides double the impact if you give in the next few days. Please give now, 1-800-347-5151, or visit pointofview.net. Make a difference for the future. That future is now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
By the way, if you'd like to join us, you can certainly do so on air, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back because we have a lot to cover here in this next couple of segments. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about Maxine Waters and what she said. The Supreme Court decided to vacate a decision out of Washington. What does that mean? I do need to at least say something about Time Magazine's cover of the crying girl, which the father says was completely misrepresented, and we might get into a couple of other issues. But as I mentioned just a minute ago, we are in the midst of also encouraging you as we come to the end of our fiscal year to support this ministry. And if you've been listening to it, even for a short period of time, as it has begun this new hour in which we broadcast, and so now there's 3 hours of Point of View instead of 2, this noontime hour is just a great opportunity for you to join with us at 800-347-5151. But I was telling you the story of Lori Miller, but I thought it would be appropriate for just a minute for you to hear her story about how Point of View was so influential in her life.
Well, I went to the school. Actually, I went online to see if it was available to my children through their online school library. And much to my amazement, after kind of ignoring your letter for a couple days and it mysteriously, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, showing back up on my desk, I found that not only was it in our library, but it was actually at my child's school. And so I went and checked out the book and thought, well, I need to check this out because the description that Kerby gave it was just so incredible. I couldn't even imagine that would be true. And so I went and looked, and sure enough, it was not. His description didn't do it justice. It was more vile than even his description. So I approached the librarian, and I did so in a way that was very discreet and very quiet, thinking that she would be just as appalled as I was. And much to my amazement, not only was she not appalled, but she was incensed that I would question her ability to pick out books for my children. That book is actually, in my opinion, benign compared to this new material. The material that I've been able to uncover is so descriptive and so vile. If made into a movie using the excerpts and language in the books, they would be rated N-17, if not X. I actually did go when I found out that this stuff was there and found out the attitude of the librarian, and I said, I want to see what my daughter's checked out. And this was at a middle school. She was in the 7th grade, so she's 12. And they said, we can't do that. And I said, excuse me? And they said, well, we can't reveal that information. That violates her privacy. And I said, she doesn't have any privacy. She's 12. and they said, well, that breaks the law. And I said, you're kidding me. And they said, no, and if you persist, we will call the authorities. And I said, you know what? That's fine. I will leave, but I can assure you, you have not heard the last of this. So I contacted the board, and our board was mortified. And, of course, now they feel threatened because the NCAC, which is the National Coalition Against Censorship, sent a letter that, and I think I sent that to you. Well, I would submit to you that I spent 4 years in the U.S. Navy and was aboard a ship for a couple of weeks. And some of these words, my husband and I had to look up. And that's really saying something because I thought that I had really been exposed to a very permissive worldview, and some of the stuff I was asking my husband, what is this? And we had to Google search it. So I would just really, really encourage parents to please don't let this go, that our children are being attacked right under our noses. You know, we go to the trouble to get internet filters. I go to the trouble to monitor my children do not watch television indiscriminately. They do not listen to secular music. They do not participate in a lot of the other things that go on. And you know what? I just sent them to school thinking that, okay, I know I'm going to have to fight the evolution battle. I know I'm going to have to fight the other battles. But I didn't have any idea that I was going to have to fight absolute sheer pornography.
So again, just an illustration of one individual equipped with some information to become an activist. And of course, she was alluding to the fact that after this, she found some other books and some other resources and began to express more concerns to the board and all of the rest. And this is the kind of thing that we want to do, to educate you, to equip you, to empower you, to make a difference in your community. So your gift helps support, indirectly, if you will, but in some respects, a very direct connection to people like Lori and all sorts of others. So without hesitation, I ask you to consider what you might do to give, even as we go to the next break. 800-347-5151 for your gift. Let's, if we can, get back to the story here, and that is that you would expect that in the midst of what seems to be not only heated rhetoric, but a number of protests, that there would be a calming influence. And maybe that's going to come. I don't know. The president, as he is wont to do, made a Twitter comment and said that the Red Hen restaurant should focus more on cleaning its filthy canopies, doors, and windows, badly needed a paint job, rather than refusing to serve a fine person like Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I always had a rule, he says, if a restaurant is dirty on the outside, it's dirty on the inside. So he did make a comment about the appearance of the restaurant, which and again, like it or don't like what the president has to say, I think we should be appalled by what a member of Congress, Maxine Waters, said. She claimed that God was on the side of people who drove Trump officials out of restaurants. She said this during a speech at Keep Families Together rally on Saturday. Already you have members, she said, of your cabinet that are being booed out of restaurants. We have protesters taking up at their houses who are saying, no peace, no sleep, no peace, no sleep, which again gets right back to Kirsten Nielsen, but also Anjit Pai, who is an FCC commissioner. And she again said, if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and create a crowd. You push back on them, tell them they're not welcome. Now, again, some of the ways it's sometimes helpful to think through these issues is imagine it was reversed. Let's imagine that in some restaurant, an Obama administration official, somebody in the cabinet, it could be Eric Holder, who was an attorney general under him, or it could have been one of the speech people, or Valerie Jarrett. She was in the news the other day, so let's use that one. Valerie Jarrett's actually asked to leave a restaurant, or Valerie Jarrett is there and there are protesters out. First of all, you know that would be a bigger story than this one would be. But then let's keep it going. Let's imagine then that some Republican member of Congress stands up at a meeting, and let's pick, Joe Wilson. Remember the one time he was in the State of the Union address and he said, you lie. Let's say, okay, Congressman Joe Wilson stands up and says, we need to do more of this. We need to shame these individuals. We need to go to every restaurant. We need to begin to call out any cabinet officer in any department store, in any gasoline station. You need to create a crowd. You need to push back on them. Can you imagine the reaction? First of all, the reaction to what would have happened in the restaurant. And then second of all, the reaction to a member of Congress saying that. And I hope that gives you a sense about the sort of ho-hum reaction that we're getting, at least in some quarters, about the speech by Maxine Waters. But Larry Elder will be with us a little bit later. Maybe he's got some comments, and we'll talk about his book. But I think before we're done, I'm sure he'll have at least one comment about Maxine Waters. But let me update you on the Supreme Court. The court has ruled in one case having to do with compelled speech, and that is Masterpiece Cake Shop. It has two more to rule on. One has to do with pregnancy resource centers, and that case is coming down very quickly. Another one on the issue of compulsory union dues and those kinds of things. But a case that has not gone to the court and will not for the moment was a case out of Washington. You might remember that Baronelle Stutzman was asked by two individuals that wanted to have a same-sex union to do the flowers. Now, she has worked with these individuals before. They've been a customer. Matter of fact, I understand she has people that call themselves homosexual or have same-sex attraction in her business. But she said, I really can't, in good conscience do that. And so it immediately was something where the Attorney General of the state of Washington brought suit against her, and not only against her business, but against her home. She could lose her business, she could lose her home, and all the rest. Well, today the Supreme Court threw out this lower court ruling that actually found that this florist, Barronelle Stutzman, had intentionally discriminated against a same-sex couple for refusing to make a flower arrangement for their wedding. The justices vacated the ruling and sent the case back to the lower court in light of the decision they gave earlier this month on the Colorado baker's refusal. Now, Kennedy said states are well within their power to enact anti-discrimination. I think this is a good example of another one of those ink blot tests that I talk about where everybody sees in it what they want to see. Some of the religious liberty people see this as a victory, and it is for the moment for Barronelle Stutzman. But this article I'm reading from is where the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, said, oh, yeah, it'll just go back to the court and they'll rule the same way. They just may take out any of the hostile language and still come to the same conclusion. Frankly, I think they're probably right, because after all, this was a case brought by the state itself. When have you seen the state say, oh, we made a mistake, we'll change our minds? Don't think so. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1925, the Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial was erected to honor the 49 men of Prince George's County, Maryland, who gave their lives in World War I. It stands outside of Washington, D.C. in the median near the National Defense Highway. This memorial, one of the oldest memorials on U.S. soil to honor the fallen of World War I, has stood without complaint for nearly a century. For the first time in over 9 decades, the American Humanist Association voiced a complaint. They filed a federal lawsuit seeking to topple the memorial because those who erected it chose the shape of a cross to honor the fallen. One of the mothers who supported the memorial early on noted to her senator that her son died and was buried in Europe. Though she could not visit his grave there, she said, she considered the Bladensburg World War I memorial to be her son's grave marker close to home. First Liberty Institute, along with our volunteer attorneys at the law firm of Jones Day, represents the American Legion who erected the memorial in 1925. This memorial was erected to honor heroes who gave their lives in defense of freedom. To tear this memorial down now would not only desecrate their memory, it would demonstrate a level of hostility to religion that our founding fathers warned against. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we are spending some time looking at a number of stories, and I wanted to move beyond some of these because, of course, we have the story of Sarah Huckabee Sanders, we have the story, of course, Maxine Waters, we have the decision, which is sort of a non-decision coming down from the Supreme Court, but I thought for a moment, let's get back to this issue of immigration, and there are at least two issues I wanted to put on the table. Issue number one has to do with Time magazine. I was going to avoid it, but a couple of other people have talked about it, and you may have seen the cover of Time magazine, where a couple of days ago there was a picture taken of this young Honduran girl, Yanela Sanchez, who was crying next to her mother, who was not being anything other than frisked, make sure she wasn't carrying weapons. And you might say, well, why would they do that? MS-13, drug smugglers, drug cartels. Are you not aware of what's going on at the border? But okay, we can leave that for the moment. So they took the picture of the crying girl next to Donald Trump. And, of course, Donald Trump's looking down kind of like a velociraptor or a T-Rex or something like that. And it says simply, "Welcome to America." Okay, I knew the game was going to be played that way. They're actually were an attempt to blame Trump for something that has been taking place really since the Clinton administration, as we've tried to explain on this program, certainly during the Bush and Obama administration. But because of the zero tolerance, we've seen a few more. But there were actually, I think, as many, if not more, children at the border many years ago when there was the rush of those individuals. But this, I thought, was kind of interesting because according to the girl's father, his 2-year-old daughter was detained with her mother at a Texas facility, and the two were not separated. The Honduran government, by the way, confirms the father's claims. And according to the father, the girl's mother left without telling him she was taking the girl with her, and so he could not contact her. Imagine living in Honduras, maybe in poverty-stricken conditions. I don't know their circumstances. I just simply know that all of a sudden, one day, his wife and his younger daughter, 2-year-old daughter, is gone. By the way, they have 3 other children together, so I assume he's there with the other 3 children back in Honduras. And they make the trek from Honduras. And if you've ever even walked a little bit in Mexico, you know exactly how long and tedious that was, even if they were taking trucks and trains and everything else, and eventually end up at the Texas border. And so then, according to the father, the girl's mother left without telling him where she was taking the girl. And then he saw the picture taken by the Getty image photographer John Moore on the news. And he says, quote, "You can imagine how I felt when I saw the photo of my daughter. It broke my heart. It's difficult as a father to see that, but I know that they are not in danger. They are safer now than when they were making that journey to the border." Of course, he said, "I didn't support it. I asked her why. Why would she want to put our little girl through that? But it was her decision." And so that's why the mother and the young 2-year-old daughter are at the Texas border. Whether they stay there or return back, of course, we'll figure that out over time. And that's, of course, one of the many decisions that will be made by many of these immigration judges. And, of course, we'll be watching the votes this week on both the Senator Ted Cruz bill and the Senator Dianne Feinstein bill. See if any of them go anywhere. I'm skeptical, but we'll see. And that brings me to one last point before we take our break again, and that has to do with the fact that many of these stories are contrived. Of course, we look at Time magazine, and they put this picture of this child standing by herself, not with her mother, crying in front of Donald Trump, as if it to suggest that he has separated that child. Well, of course, they use it as an image to talk about separated children. But you have Ann Coulter last week documenting all sorts of cases, intentionally lying, even coached in lying. And the reason she wrote this is because she mentioned this on TV for The Hill, which, by the way, I quote quite often because it is the, if you will, the journalistic record of Capitol Hill. But anyway, this woman, Jacqueline Thompson, said she couldn't find the quote, the footnote quote that Ann Coulter mentioned from the New Yorker. And, of course, Ann Coulter says, wait a minute, my book, Adios America, has nearly 100 pages of footnotes. It's right there. And then if you have ever heard of Google, do a Google search, she points out that if you just type in even any kind of word there, like New Yorker, asylum, coaching, coached, it took all of 3 seconds for her to find the article that she was referring to. And so now I'm not quoting Ann Coulter, I'm quoting New Yorker, okay? This is a pretty liberal organization, and their article begins with Caroline, an illegal alien from a middle-class family in Africa, who passed herself off to U.S. immigration authorities as a victim of rape and torture, as she admitted to the New Yorker while giggling, "I've never been raped." But fortunately, Caroline had been tutored in how to act like a rape victim by her landlady in the Bronx, who hadn't been raped either, but had successfully applied for asylum. Then talks about another individual, Beatrice Muanenzi, and I'm probably butchering the name, applied for asylum and citizenship. And they actually allowed her and her kids to live off the U.S. taxpayers for 10 years before federal prosecutors noticed something. She wasn't a victim of the Rwandan genocide. She was a perpetrator of the Rwandan genocide. She had personally sentenced thousands of Rwanda women and children to death, and so as a result had received all sorts of benefits for 10 years, simply because nobody really checked deeply into her story. And, of course, they did point out now, because she actually has been prosecuted by the International Court, she is separated from her children, which I guess in that case we might agree with. One more real quickly. One asylum applicant written about in the New York Times claims she was being persecuted in Russia because she was gay. She told the immigration lawyer, "I'm not gay at all. I don't even like gay people," and on and on and on. So, again, the point I'm making is not that all of these stories are fake, not that even a majority of them are, but some of them are, and that's why we have to do what we can, what you might call due diligence, to make sure asylum and make certain claims, we check them out. And the sad reality is most of them we can't check out, so then where does the burden of proof lie, on us or on those individuals? And it just is, again, for you as a viewer, as a reader, and as a listener, watch, read, and listen with some discernment. Let's take a break. When we come back, we will get into our conversation with Larry Elder. But again, as we've talked about this week, during this very important week for us, the end of our fiscal year, this is a time in which we really want to educate you about the issues, and I'm thinking about Joy in California. She said she really became politically involved in listening to Point of View. By listening to Point of View, especially in our Friday weekend edition, she learned a lot more about how religious liberty and Christian liberty is in danger. She also, of course, appreciated the fact that we do Christian apologetics, and this would be a way for him to be an unapologetic Christian apologist, and really taught her, in some ways, how to be more courageous about her beliefs. So if you appreciate the impact that your gift can make in educating, empowering, and certainly encouraging others to make a difference in the community, let me, as we go to a break right now, encourage you to visit our website, which is pointofview.net. And there's an opportunity for you to hear another story that we have posted there. Opportunity for you to make a one-time donation, but I hope some of you might even consider giving on a monthly basis and to help us out, because our bills come in monthly. So if our income comes in monthly, that really helps us out. And, of course, you can not only go to pointofview.net, but you can also call the off-air line, which is our pledge line, 1-800-347-5151. Let's take a break. Talk show host and author Larry Elder will.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress, but thankfully, Don Blythe had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We are privileged to have with us for a few minutes here Larry Elder, and of course you're very familiar with him. We quote from him quite often here on the program, best-selling author and nationally syndicated talk show host. We're going to talk a little bit about a book that came out many years ago with a different title, Dear Father, Dear Son, which is now out with a new afterword, A Lot Like Me, A Father and Son's Journey to Reconciliation. It is published by Regnery. You will be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have information about it on our website as well. If you've ever listened to El Dorado, you know certainly he spends a fair amount of time providing an analysis of some of the myths and hypocrisies that we see in our society. A graduate of Brown University with a BA in political science, also an individual that graduated from the University of Michigan School of Law, and is, of course, now best known as a guest on Fox News, a radio talk show host on Salem Radio Network, and also established what are called Larry Elder Charities. And we have a lot more information about that on the website, but without further ado, Larry Elder, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate the good work that you're doing, and let's talk about the book for a little bit, but I suspect before I let you go before the bottom of the hour, you'll have something to say about Maxine Waters, but let's educate our listeners here, because you had a father that is brutal. That's a nice phrase to use. It's kind of the new normal, Randolph Elder, and your elder brother, I guess, Kirk, you did some things that probably deserve some discipline, but you didn't deserve the harsh treatment and the put-downs that you received. So tell us what it was like a little bit to live in the Elder household.
Or so I thought. I disliked my father, Kerby, but my brothers disliked him too. So I didn't think it was me. I thought it was him. He was ill-tempered, I thought. And, of course, in those days, wait till your father comes home was the mantra, and 3 rambunctious boys. So it was my dad's job to spank us. We didn't like him anyway, and then when he came home, we knew we were going to get punished. So I liked the fact that he worked long hours because he was never around, and when he was around, there was tension in the house. Well, I'm 12 years old, and darn it, he starts a small cafe, so therefore all of us now have to work for him. I don't like working for him because he's ill-tempered. He barks at me. It's a little cafe, and so when he's barking at you, the other people in the cafe can hear it, and it's embarrassing.
Yes.
So now I'm 15 years old. I'd love to tell you that I was man enough to go up to my dad and say, now see here, pal, here's how it's going to be from now on. So I told myself the next time he yells at me, I'm going to leave, which was a major act of defiance. He yelled at me. I left. 15 years old, a restaurant full of people. The waitress had called in sick, so my dad was furious when he got home. And he said, why did you leave? And I said, I got tired of the way you spoke to me. My dad paid me $10 a day plus tips. He balled to the $10. He threw it at me as I lay on the bed. He walked out of my bedroom, and Kerby, he and I did not speak for 10 years.
Yes.
And when I say did not speak, I mean did not speak. I graduate from high school. I go to college on the East Coast. I go to law school, as you know, in Ohio, in Michigan, and then I end up working in Ohio. So I'm able pretty much to avoid him. And now I'm 25 years old. I passed the California bar. I passed the Ohio bar. I'm making the equivalent of around $150,000 at 25 years old. I should be living large. I can't sleep. And I know it has something to do with my unresolved issue with my dad. Not that I ever thought we'd be friends, but I figured I should at least sit down with him for 5 or 10 minutes, tell him what an SOB I think he is. He called me an ungrateful son. At least we clear the air. I'd be able to sleep. So I canceled all my appointments. I flew out to California. without telling my parents I was coming because I didn't want my dad to prepare for this 5 or 10 minute confrontation. I go to the restaurant at 1:30. It closed at 2:30. I had 2 big bags. My dad says, I put those bags in the back. He was surprised to see me. And I said, no, Dad, I'm only going to be here for 5 or 10 minutes. I want to tell you something. So I sat there for an hour, and I said, Larry, don't tee off on the man. Just give him the highlights. And 5 minutes, tell him what an SOB he is. He'll tell you you're ungrateful. You're out the door. My dad sat down, and, of course, I teed off on him. I told him everything I thought he'd ever done, everything he'd ever said to me, everything that I thought was unfair. I talked for 25 minutes nonstop. Finally, I'm out of ammo, Kerby, and he looks up and he says, is that it? You didn't speak to me for 10 years because of that? And for the first time, I saw my father cry. Wow. And he told me about his father. And it turns out that my last name, Elder, is not the name of his biological father. He never knew his biological father. I'm hearing this for the first time. I'm 25 years old. I mean, I knew my dad had no relatives because we never got any presents from any of that side of the family. But beyond that, I knew nothing about the man. And so he's telling me that his illiterate mom, who never worked, had a series of boyfriends, each one more irresponsible than the one before. He's 13 years old. He comes home. He has a quarrel with his mom's then boyfriend. She sides with the boyfriend, throws my father out of the house, never to return. You're talking about a black boy, Jim Crow South, Athens, Georgia, at the beginning of the Great Depression. Not very many people have had a hand dealt like that. My dad goes down the road, takes any job he could get. Ultimately, he becomes a Pullman porter. They were the largest private employer of blacks in those days. So this little black boy from the South was able to travel all around the country and kind of made a mental note that maybe someday I'll relocate to California, where he'd been out on the run because it was sunnier, people seemed less racist. Pearl Harbor, my dad joins the Marines. I said, why? He said, they go where the action is, and I love the uniforms. My dad went stationed in Guam. He was a staff sergeant, promoted 4 times, and became in charge of the cooking facilities. The man can make anything, bake anything, cook anything. He goes back to the South after the war, Chattanooga, where he had met and married my mom, and tries to get him a job as a cook. And he goes to restaurant after restaurant after restaurant, and he's told, we don't hire N-words. Yes. My dad goes to the unemployment office. The lady says, you went through the wrong door. He goes out to the hall, sees colored only, goes through that door to the very same lady who sent him out. And he came home to my mom and said, this is BS. I'm going to California. I'm going to get me a job as a cook. He comes out here, walks around for 2 days. Nobody will hire him because they tell him he has no references. My dad said, I'll work for free. Just give me a reference. They wouldn't even do that. So he was treated the same way in Los Angeles as he was in Chattanooga. They were just a little more polite about it. He goes to an unemployment office, this time just one door, takes the first job, which is cleaning toilets for 10 years at a company called Nabisco. Takes a second job full-time with another bread company called Barber and Bread. He cooked for a family on the weekends to make additional money, and he went to night school a couple of nights a week to get his GED. The man, Kerby, never slept, which is why he was always cranky.
Yeah.
You go dance every day, week after week, month after month, year after year with very little sleep, come home to a rambunctious house full of boys and see how you feel. So this conversation spans 8 hours. 8
hours, yes.
And during the 8 hours, the man is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I am getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And finally, I said to my dad, I am so sorry. He looked at me and he said, Larry, don't be. You didn't know. But please follow the advice I've always given you and your brothers. Hard work wins. Yes. You get out of life what you put into it. You cannot, Larry, control the outcome, but you are 100% in control of the effort. And before you whine about what somebody did to you, go to the nearest mirror, look at it, and say, how could I have changed the outcome? And finally, no matter how good you are, how hard you work, bad things will happen. Yes. How you deal with those bad things will tell your mom and me whether or not we raised a man.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation for just a few more minutes with Larry Elder. Again, I know that you appreciate the work that he does. We quote him so often, post some of his articles, and certainly enjoy listening to him on radio and watching him on television. The new book, though, A Lot Like Me, A Father and Son's Journey to Reconciliation, a memoir. It is published by Regnery, almost 300 pages, and we have information about it on our website. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Larry Elder right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This summer, we will certainly hear that the warmer temperatures demonstrate that we are headed for a climate doomsday. That is why Vijay Jairaj wrote an article with the provocative title, Why Climate Doomsday Won't Happen This Summer. I suppose his predictions could be as accurate as any of the others we've heard. He has 4 points. First, the world just experienced one of its coldest recorded winters in history. Cities like New York registered record snowfall. Many cities in the U.S. and Canada broke 80-year record lows, and even the U.K. experienced snowy conditions well into spring. He is quick to acknowledge that a cold winter doesn't guarantee a mild summer, but he believes that we might at least remind ourselves that global temperatures have not been increasing in the way we've been warned in the media. Second, global average temperature is rising, but it isn't even as close to the rate claimed by climate alarmists. At the very least, it would suggest that the climate computer models are missing key data and information. If the models don't model reality, something must be off. At least that was the conclusion we reached when I was in graduate school doing computer models and simulations. Third, carbon dioxide emissions are not the primary driver of global temperatures. The last 2 decades constituted the highest increase in carbon dioxide, yet the rate of global temperatures was lower than in previous decades. And finally, the Arctic and Antarctic ice masses are stable. Alarmists talk about the Arctic melting because the Antarctic ice mass is increasing. In fact, even the Arctic mass is stable, and it's worth mentioning that the polar bear populations are stable. These are just a few facts to remember the next time you hear someone in the media predicting an imminent climate doomsday. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Larry Elder for a few more minutes. Best-selling author, nationally syndicated talk show host. Also says that he's the recipient of a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And when you were on with Mike Gallagher the other day, you two talked about that. And that is pretty amazing as well. But let's, if we can, Larry, for just a minute, talk about how people can use this book. Because I know Father's Day has passed, but let's just for a minute talk to our listeners who maybe have a man in their life who's estranged from their father. This book, I think, would be quite an impact and would be one that might really be helpful. I know that you've had feedback also from a number of women who have talked about the absence of their father and how that affected them. So whether you're a man or a woman, I think you could really benefit from some of the things you write about in the book.
Well, that's why I wrote it. I certainly hope so. 40% today of kids are raised without dads in the home. And I didn't say this. Obama said a kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in jail. It is far and away the number one social problem in our country. And in 1965, 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. Now 73% are. Almost 50% of Hispanic kids are. And when I was in college, there was a report that came out in 1965 called The Negro Family, A Case for National Action, written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who later on became a senator from New York. At the time, 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock, which he thought was an alarming number, and talked about all the social negative consequences of that. Well, fast forward 25%, Kerby, of white kids are now born outside of wedlock. Why we're not having a debate about the connection between the welfare state and the rise of fatherlessness is beyond me. I believe government has incentivized women to marry the government and allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. We're talking about these kids being separated at the border. There are 2,000 of them temporarily being separated from their parents. What about
I think we lost you.
Incentives that
there. Okay, go ahead.
I said, what about the non-formation of families because of the perverse incentives that we're providing with our welfare state? The left doesn't want to talk about that.
Yeah, well, and again, your point's well taken. Let me just mention that we have a link to your website, LarryElder.com, and I think that would be helpful for people to get some of those facts and figures. And I think one of the reasons we're not talking about it is look how Daniel Patrick Moynihan and others were treated when they talked about what that might happen.
That's right.
And today,
That's right.
what was rare has now become routine, so pastors aren't addressing it from the pulpit, politicians aren't addressing it out on the stump, and it's just, again, why some of us in the talk show business need to address those. But I wanted to at least get one comment from you. You have certainly spent many hours on your program over the years talking about Maxine Waters, but this latest one is amazing. God is on the side of people driving Trump officials from the restaurants. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you tell them to get out and create a crowd, and you push back on them, tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. As you like to say so often, can you believe that?
Well, people ought not be surprised. She's often considered to be one of the most irresponsible members of the House. There's a left-wing ethics group that calls her one of the most corrupt members of Congress. And let's remember, this is a woman who wrote a letter to Fidel Castro urging him not to extradite back to America a woman named Joanne Chesimard, who is number one on the New Jersey top 10 wanted list because she murdered a New Jersey state trooper, escaped, fled to Cuba, and resides there today as we speak. And when Congress passed a resolution demanding that Castro return her, Maxine Waters wrote a letter to Castro urging him to keep her and compared her to a freedom fighter and likened her to Martin Luther King. I kid you not.
Well, again, we will, after you leave, talk a little bit more about what happened to Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And again, I say that a restaurant, including your dad's restaurant, has a right to decide who they're going to serve or not. If no shoes, no shirt, no service, and if you want to do that. But the reality is that I'm sure you've noticed this as well. The rhetoric is starting to heat up. Kirsten Nielsen, Stephen Miller. We can talk about even what happened in Florida this week to Pam Bondi and on and on. Somewhere along the line, we need some members of Congress to tamp down the rhetoric, not heat it up, don't you think?
I agree, and it's perfectly okay. People on the left are cheering what happened to Sarah Sanders, and this restaurant owner apparently took a vote, and her staff decided that they didn't want her, so they asked her to leave. The same people, on the other hand, were demanding that the Masterpiece Cake Shop bake a cake for a gay wedding. So they're not even consistent. They're just it's Trump derangement syndrome gone amok, and it's only going to get worse, in my opinion.
Well, again, we have a link to your website. I know you need to go in just a minute, but again, there's a way which people can sign up to be an El Dorado, which I mentioned and again, the Sage from South Central. But the book, I'm sure a lot of people find in their bookstore, but if people want to get on your website, you just provide all sorts of facts and figures, and I sometimes find myself quoting you or maybe a few other individuals because of some of the facts and figures coming out from Black Lives Matter. And so sometimes you need to come back and recognize that sometimes we just aren't getting the true information. That's why we need to be paying attention to some of these alternative sources of media, don't you think?
I couldn't agree more. The Black Lives Matter is one of the biggest racial hoaxes perpetrated on this country since a large number of people believe that O.J. Simpson was innocent for murdering two people. It's a fraud. The police are not engaging in racial profiling. It's been studied many, many times. It's very rare for an unarmed black person to be killed by a cop. And most of the blacks were killed by cops who were resisting arrest, had a weapon, and according to the Washington Post, only 4% of all the police shootings involve an unarmed black man, white cop, and unarmed does not mean not dangerous. Michael Brown was unarmed, but his DNA was found on the officer's gun. So just because you're unarmed does not mean you're not dangerous. It's rare for anybody to be killed by the police, let alone an unarmed black person, for crying out loud. 6,000 homicides, black on black last year, and we're talking about the rare instance in which a black person is killed by the police. Not fair, and we're spending too much time on the wrong stuff. We ought to be talking about what we talked about earlier, Kerby, and that is the non-formation of families, what we can do to strengthen families and improve schools.
Well, again, so often I find myself quoting either Heather McDonald or Larry Elder or both. And so, again, appreciate the work that you do and appreciate the fact that you had her on. And, of course, you have Sebastian Gork on and a lot of other individuals. Right. So, again, just appreciate the work that you do. And thank you for writing the book. Again, we have a link to your website so that people can find out a little bit more about Larry Elder. It's just very simple, LarryElder.com. And, again, those are some resources that are available. and I encourage our listeners to be listening to you on radio. So thanks for joining us today here on Point of View.
And Kerby, thanks for all the work you've been doing for all these years. Thank you so much for the honor to be on your program. I appreciate it.
Looking forward to the next opportunity. Well, let's take a break, and we'll give you a chance to join the conversation. But if you are just joining us today, let me just mention that I've said before that the most important week in Point of View is probably the last week in December, just before we finish our calendar year. The second most important week is this week, and this is the last week before the end of our fiscal year. We really want to end our fiscal year in the black, and we do have some financial needs. So let me encourage you to consider what you might do to support this ministry. And when you do so, you're really supporting those people that go out and make a difference. And we just talked about some of the issues on campus. Let me, for just a minute, have a chance to hear from our friend Vicky Garza, who, in listening to this program, began to take some of these ideas onto the campus.
All my life, I always looked for ways to help people, but I would be frustrated because I didn't know how to help. And that's what I learned when I dialed in that day to Point of View. I learned how to help, not only myself and my family, but I also learned how to help others. And it's actually totally changed my life. We have this You Arise ministry now. It was started in January of 2012, and we are refining the model over here at SMU, but the idea is to bring health and wellness resources that are biblically based onto the campus through the RAs, so that when they're approached by students in need and who have some sort of crisis happening in their lives, they will be trained and able. You don't know when you give to Point of View who you're touching and how much that person is going to be able to touch others. And ultimately, it could go out and touch thousands, even millions of people, because you were willing to be a part of this ministry, to invest in this ministry. And I can't say enough about how it's touched my life and changed me completely.
Again, Vicky Garza, just one individual that was able to be educated and empowered to go out and make a difference. And sometimes it's just the power of information. I've had some of you, as you've written in your letters, have talked about how you, for the first time, became politically involved. I've had some of you say, I really appreciate some of the material you do on apologetics, not only helping us know how to articulate a biblical point of view, but also know how to defend a biblical point of view. And one individual said, I'm an unapologetic Christian apologist. So that is an opportunity. But again, maybe this has encouraged you to be maybe bolder in your Christian faith, willing to speak out on some of those issues. And certainly that is one more reason why I hope that you will consider what you might do, even today as we go to a break, to support Point of View. Number of ways you can do that. First of all, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. That's where you can find out more about Larry Elder if you'd like to find your link to that website. And I might just mention that a little bit later we're going to have Steve and Jackie Green of Hobby Lobby on the program with us, and so you can find all those resources. But you can also click on that button that says donate, and a one-time gift would certainly be appreciated. But if you would also consider what you might want to do to support us on a monthly basis, that would be even more beneficial to this ministry. And of course, if you would like to talk to someone off air, that number is 800-347-5151. We'll be back right after this.
Ronnie fixes cars in a shop on his property. That allows him to earn a living for his family and be home to help care for Michael. Ronnie and Judy adopted Michael more than 20 years ago, knowing he would never walk or be able to care for himself. But through listening to Point of View, they were convicted that every life God gives is precious. So even though Ronnie is now 69 and Judy can't lift Michael anymore, every day is a labor of love and a testimony to their faith. Providing for their family isn't easy, and yet every month for almost 15 years, they've invested in Point of View. Some listeners have changed their communities and the nation. Ronnie and Judy changed everything for Michael. Your gift to Point of View in June is an investment in changed lives, and a matching challenge provides double the impact if you give in the next few days. Please give now, 1-800-347-5151, or visit pointofview.net. Make a difference for the future. That future is now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let's spend a little bit of time talking about what's unfolded over the weekend. Of course, we've already alluded to that a little bit, the story of Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And let me just give you my conclusions on the front end, and that is a restaurant has a right to refuse service for a variety of reasons, and even for reasons of political discrimination. I'll get into that in just a minute. We may not like it, but I appreciate the fact that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, even though she was asked to leave, did not make a big deal about it. Now, some people said, well, she did post a issue. Well, that's because later on some other posts ended up on Twitter, and maybe she would have anyway, but who knows. But I've posted the first article here is from the Washington Post, which really tells the story from the viewpoint of the owner, or at least the chef. I'm not sure. In one place she's called the owner, I guess a co-owner, and also called the chef. But anyway, Stephanie Wilkinson, who is at the Red Hen. Anyway, the story is pretty simple. Sarah Huckabee Sanders walks in with a number of people. The staff are concerned. They call Stephanie Wilkinson, who is the co-owner and chef at home, and she's like, really? This is rural Virginia. I used to live in the Washington, D.C. area when I went to Georgetown, and I know kind of where this is, in Lexington, Virginia. It's pretty good distance out there, but nevertheless, she says, well, let me go check. And she walks in the door, and there it is, Sarah Huckabee Sanders and some others. And so she says, well, I believe that she works in the service of an administration that is inhumane and unethical. So she steps in the back, as this article talks about, and asks the various staff, what do you want me to do? And they said, I can ask her to leave. And they said, yes. So she comes up, and now I'll just read from the story. She said, I'm the owner. I'd like to come out to the patio with me for a word. They stepped outside into a small enclosure, but at least out of the crowded restaurant. Stephanie, the co-owner and chef, says, I babbled a little bit, but I got to the point across in a polite and direct fashion. I explained that the restaurant has certain standards that I feel it has to uphold, such as honesty, compassion, and cooperation. I said, I'd like to ask you to leave. Now, again, you have to understand the context. She, even in this article, points out that in the county, it voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. But this particular, if you will, community, it's about 7,000 people, is sort of a blue dot in a red sea. So they voted overwhelmingly against Donald Trump. And so it's where a number of people from the kind of the Northeast have come down and resided. And so nevertheless, Sarah Sanders' response was, that's fine, I'll go. And then since they already had a kind of a cheese plate on the table, they offered to pay, but Stephanie Wilkinson said, no, it's on the house. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders then later tweeted, after some other tweets had come out, last night I was told by the owner of Red Hen in Lexington, Virginia to leave because I work for the President of the United States, and I politely left. Her actions say far more about her than about me. I always do my best to treat people, including those I disagree with, respectfully, and will continue to do so. So that's the article I've posted for you to read. Let me just add that the Washington Post writers either did not know or decided to leave out something that Mike Huckabee, who is the father of Sarah Huckabee Sanders, pointed out, and that is after they left, the co-owner and chef, Stephanie Wilkinson, followed them across the street, berated them, and made a scene when they tried to go to another restaurant. So that sort of was out of the picture. But nevertheless, it is part of a kind of a heated up rhetoric that is starting to take place. You have, for example, Kirstjen Nielsen, who is the Homeland Security Secretary, and Stephen Miller, who's a senior advisor. Kirstjen Nielsen was in a restaurant in the Washington, D.C. area, and there were all sorts of people protesting and yelling at her and doing all sorts of things. Kirstjen Nielsen, you're a villain, locking up immigrant children, and they made quite a scene. And so the manager later told people that they were not upset about the protesters at all. Matter of fact, here's a direct quote from the manager of the restaurant. We're not upset the protesters came here, and we're not upset even if any of our staff who tipped them off were protesters. We are happy about what happened. And so that has taken place. Of course, I mentioned Stephen Miller. And now what has happened even more interestingly is they have now not only chased him out of a restaurant, but interestingly enough have posted his personal phone number online and that's starting to change some things as well. Let's, if I can, move to the state of Florida. Those of you in Florida may know what happened there, and that is, in this case, we're not talking about a Trump cabinet member, but nevertheless, this is the Florida Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who required a police escort away from a movie about Mr. Rogers. You might be familiar that they've done a documentary on Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and this happened in Tampa, and also where two other political individuals, Republican lawmakers, were politically harassed as well. And so that's part of the issue. Now, she said that she and her friend were confronted at least 4 times while buying tickets, entering the theater, standing in line in the concession stand. At one point, activists were yelling so loudly that they spit on her hair. Not sure that was intentional or just accidental, but nevertheless received all sorts of taunts. Now, the activists say that's not the case, and they showed a video, and they said Pam Bondi's version of the events is inaccurate and don't reflect what happened. Well, instantaneously, people came back and said, wait a minute, the videos that the group released actually are the wrong ones, or really the only ones taken. Pam Bondi says the reason for that is that the activists only released the videos that showed what happened as they were leaving the movie, and that's where the Tampa police were there, and everyone, of course, was on their best behavior. But I'd love to get your comments. Is this rhetoric beginning to get ratcheted up? Are there some things that maybe we should expect from our political leaders, whether it's the President of the United States, whether it's a member of Congress, to try to tamp down some of this rather than heat it up? Because we've talked about, of course, Kirsten Nielsen and the fact that now not only did they harass her in the restaurant, but this is important when I read a quote from Maxine Waters, they've actually gone outside her home and play audio of a baby crying, saying no justice, no sleep, about a crying infant, for example. Of course, I mentioned Stephen Miller driven out of a restaurant, being accused of being a fascist, and now you have the publication of his personal cell phone number. Of course, we mentioned Pam Bondi and those. Let me take a few more. You have a left-wing university professor, which has now created a database of over 1,500 immigration and customs enforcement employees' personal information, and they're starting to circulate some of that as well. And then the story, which is still of great concern to me, and that is, you may remember that the FCC decided to remove some of the net neutrality rules that were implemented a couple of years ago under the Obama administration, and the activists just went nuts. First of all, there were death threats to the FCC commissioner, Anjet Pai. Then activists got outside of his home, and I've got some pictures of this here, where they have the names of his children, and it said they, that is the children, will come to know the truth. Dad murdered democracy in cold blood. First of all, even if these decisions are terrible, can't we just re-implement the net neutrality rules later? Do we have to actually have death threats against the FCC commissioner? And Anjet Pai said, I understand that people are passionate about policy, but it's one thing to actually protest. It's another thing to actually involve the families, the wives, and the kids who he says should remain out of it and stop harassing us at our homes. And so that's another one. Of course, I might mention for our Ohio listeners, Rob Portman, or for our Arkansas listeners, John Bozeman, are individuals who also were being harassed at their homes. And you have quite a number of others that I've been collecting over time. A guy in Miami, Cheesecake Factory, that had the misfortune, even though he's African-American, of wearing one of those, Make America Great hats, and he ran into all sorts of difficulties. And as a matter of fact, it brings me back to one other point that I think I will make, and that is we at least have a lot of court rulings now that say you could discriminate politically, because in April, you might remember there was a judge that rejected a lawsuit, in this case by a man who said he was refused service in a New York City bar because he was wearing a Make America hat, Make America Great hat again. And the judge stated that the law does not protect political discrimination. So You have those cases. Of course, you have Ivanka Trump being harassed on a flight. You have fake blood thrown on the private home of an NRA lobbyist. You have a man who threw water on Tommy Lahren at a restaurant. The list goes on and on and on. And this is why I would say that maybe it would be good now for Maxine Waters not to say, already you have members of your cabinet that are being booed out of restaurants. We have protesters taking up at their houses who are saying no peace, no sleep, no peace, no peace. So again, maybe what she's calling for now is whether you see him in a department store, gas station, just go out and maybe in a crowd, at a restaurant, create a crowd, push back on them and tell them they're not welcome anymore. That's the future if somebody doesn't tamp this down quickly. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1925, the Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial was erected to honor the 49 men of Prince George's County, Maryland, who gave their lives in World War I. It stands outside of Washington, D.C. in the median near the National Defense Highway. This memorial, one of the oldest memorials on U.S. soil to honor the fallen of World War I, has stood without complaint for nearly a century. For the first time in over 9 decades, the American Humanist Association voiced a complaint. They filed a federal lawsuit seeking to topple the memorial because those who erected it chose the shape of a cross to honor the fallen. One of the mothers who supported the memorial early on noted to her senator that her son died and was buried in Europe. Though she could not visit his grave there, she said, she considered the Bladensburg World War I memorial to be her son's grave marker close to home. First Liberty Institute, along with our volunteer attorneys at the law firm of Jones Day, represents the American Legion who erected the memorial in 1925. This memorial was erected to honor heroes who gave their lives in defense of freedom. To tear this memorial down now would not only desecrate their memory, it would demonstrate a level of hostility to religion that our founding fathers warned against. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some phone calls. And let me just mention that in the next hour, we'll have Steve and Jackie Green. They are the founding family of the Museum of the Bible. Of course, he is also the president of Hobby Lobby. And that'll be a great opportunity to talk about Hobby Lobby, some of the issues of religious liberty, as well as this incredible museum, the Museum of the Bible, which I've had a chance to see. But if you'd like to join our conversation, maybe you have some comments about the level of not only verbal violence, but in some case actual violence, and the need, I think, for some calm voices in the midst of this. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out, first of all, to South Carolina on the Good News Network. Alton, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yeah, I'm glad to talk to you. I've been wanting to talk to you about this for a while, and every time I call in, it's time runs out. So, yeah, y'all mentioned a while ago about Black Lives Matters. I've always been confused by this. Where I live at, close to Columbia and Augusta, Georgia, on TV, about 80 or 90% is black on black. And then when somebody in authority, like a policeman or something, shoots a black, all of a sudden you have thousands of them marching, Black Lives Matters. Chicago, Illinois. Where's the signs? Black Lives Matters. I'm confused. I'm hoping there's some blacks on there that will call in and make a comment on this and explain it. Why? What's the difference? I don't understand. Black Lives Matters, it should matter in Chicago when they're killing each other like dogs, man. I don't get it. I'm confused.
Well, and again, Larry Elder has addressed some of that, and maybe I'll just read from one of his columns in the future, because it sounds like you're really looking for an answer, and part of it has to do with a political narrative or agenda or a template, and that is some people that have a political agenda are certainly wanting to emphasize the issue of police brutality. So they will see things through that lens. So some of it has to do with a deliberate bias on the part of the press. But I think for a variety of others, and this is going to sound callous, but I'm just trying to say this is the way it is in the media. You know, all sorts of planes land safely in the Atlanta airport. That's not news. One plane crash, that's news. Sadly, and I'm not agreeing with this, I'm just trying to explain this, we've had inner city violence for decades. And so it's almost a non-news item, but it becomes a news item if it's a young girl who is a valedictorian, or it becomes a news item if a white cop kills a black teenager. And so some of it is bias and intentional bias, but some of it I think is just, and I don't like that, because I would want to cover those stories, the incredible amount of carnage that takes place sometimes in inner cities, in large part because of gang warfare. And if you've ever gotten any of my commentaries, you know that a while back I even pointed out that it's just a very, very small percentage of counties that even have any kind of murders in them. We are still very safe in most places in the United States, but there are a few places where there's a disproportionate amount of violence. And again, I think that's news. But sometimes people in the news business don't think it's news. And then, of course, back to issues like Black Lives Matter and others, I mean, there's a political agenda there. And if you don't know that, you can read some of the material that has been published by Walter Williams, by, of course, I mentioned Heather McDonald, by Larry Elder and others. But in the interest of time, let me just take another phone call real quickly, and we'll go to Virginia this time. Ina, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, hi, Kirby. How are you today?
Good. What would you add to our conversation?
Add to this conversation that when I saw Maxine Waters, did you see her statement yesterday? I think it was on MSNBC, that she stated that the Democrats is going to release all their minions. That's what she said, on all the president followers, or anybody, in other words, that does not agree with their rhetoric, and that they're starting with all of his people or whatever. Isn't there a law against a member of Congress or any of our paid Congress, senators, whatever, to make such a statement? Shouldn't there be something against something like that she comes out and say that they're just going to release people? Isn't that inciting violence?
Yeah, I think so. And again, part of it, let's take Maxine Waters for a minute. I mean, there may be some action in the next few days of a censure of Maxine Waters, although she is almost untouchable. Some people used to say that Ronald Reagan was the Teflon president. You know, there are a lot of things that just bounce off of him. Some people suggested Donald Trump is the Teflon president now. I don't know if I agree with that, but let's just take that at face value for the moment. If there's anybody who has Teflon, it's Maxine Waters. I mean, because she is an African-American woman, a lot of things that she's been able to get away with saying have never been challenged, but I do believe that maybe there is going to be some congressional action of censure or something. And back to the point you're making, I don't know enough about the law, but let's see over the next couple of days if we can get some people on here that maybe can research that. Pretty sure Chelsea Yeoman's going to be with us on Wednesday, and she's really good at researching all sorts of federal statutes. So I'll tell you what, you deserve an answer. I'll see if we can have somebody that knows a lot more about the law provide that answer. Just before we take another phone call, though, I did want to just again mention the fact that we certainly are in the midst of this last week before our very special fiscal year end. And while we're talking about members of Congress, I thought for just a minute you might enjoy hearing a little bit from a former member of Congress, Michelle Bachmann, who started listening to Point of View at a fairly young age.
I was about 19 years old when I first met my husband, and he brought me out to the farm in Wisconsin where he lived with his parents. And every day at noontime, the radio came on, and my in-laws had the radio tuned to the Christian radio station, and it was Marlon Maddox's Point of View that came on. So I was still getting my footing for my faith. And this was very important because what Point of View taught me was the intersection of current events with my faith in Jesus Christ. And I just loved the show. I loved Marlon Maddox's personality. He was cutting edge. All the new things that you'd hear about in the news, he would be talking about on the radio station, but from a biblical worldview perspective. He very profoundly shaped a lot of my thinking during that time, and we couldn't wait to listen to it. Kerby does such a fabulous job. I've enjoyed being on the show with Kerby. It's needed now more than ever because it seems like too few pastors are willing to say from the pulpit what they need to say today. That's why I think that Kerby Anderson, what he's doing on Point of View, is probably more needed now than ever because we need to be hearing this on the radio if we aren't going to be getting it from our pulpits.
Point of View. Truth Team 360.
Again, Michelle Bachmann talking about that. And again, I want to challenge some of you to consider what you might do to support this ministry. We are listener supported, as you well know. And if you've been listening to the program any length of time, you know that we have all sorts of stories. One in particular, Joy in California said, I became more aware of my duty as a member of the Christian community to be more politically involved. We had a chance to know Michelle Bachmann, and matter of fact, Penna Dexter and I interviewed her the very first time she began to get involved in some of the education issues. That was long before she ran for the state legislature and then later ran for Congress and then, of course, even ran for the presidency. So we encourage you to support this ministry so that you can encourage and empower other individuals like Michelle Bachmann or like Joy in California or so many other listeners who have understood that they have a responsibility to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Visit our website, pointofview.net. There's a button you can click there that says donate, and your gift would be greatly appreciated, especially if you could support us on a monthly basis, but even a one-time gift so we can end this fiscal year in the black. And as we're going to a break, you can talk to someone off air, 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151 to make your pledge. We'll be right back.
Nancy was uncomfortable, to say the least. As an introvert, she didn't like controversy. But when she learned that parents were prohibited from seeing the contents of a major standardized test, she knew her responsibilities as a parent needed to outweigh her discomfort. Her daughter turned out to be the only student in her district to opt out of the test, and one of just a handful in the entire state of Texas. But she stood her ground, and the next year, Point of View helped her unite with other parents to make a difference for their children. The world loves to force us into its mold and to mock believers when we resist. Your gift to Point of View is an investment in courage and changed lives. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. Be part of amazing transformations. It all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking in to pointofview.net. One day, you were going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I've been looking forward to this hour because this is a chance where we can talk with Steve and Jackie Green. And if you're familiar with the Green family, and you should, simply because we've had so many of them on the program. David Green was on our studio a while back, giving it all away and getting it back again. And, of course, we've had Lauren on a number of times, both by phone and in studio. And Lauren and Jackie have written this book that we've talked about, Only One Life, How a Woman's Everyday Shapes an Eternal Legacy. But we're going to talk about the book that Steve and Jackie Green have put together. It's actually been out for a number of months, but we've never had a chance to really talk about that book. And, of course, we always love to talk about the Museum of the Bible. This book, This Dangerous Book, How the Bible Has Shaped Our History and Why It Still Matters Today. It is published by Zondervan. No doubt you perhaps have seen the book in your bookstore. If not, we have information about that on our website. And if you're not familiar, David Green has been with us, Lauren Green has been with us, but let me now do the honors of introducing Steve Green, who is the president of Hobby Lobby, which, of course, is the largest owned arts and crafts retailer in the world. Of course, he and his wife, Jackie, are the founding family of the Museum of the Bible, which I've had a chance to attend, and might as well get some commission for all the times I talk it up. And Jackie is also the co-founder of the Museum of the Bible, is also known as Gigi to her 4 grandchildren, and also is very much involved in the Museum of the Bible Women of Legacy. So, Steve and Jackie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. We're excited about being here.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about how you got into all of this. People say it's not typical for somebody who is maybe collecting arts and crafts to think about going on an airplane to Turkey and looking at biblical artifacts. How did that kind of unfold?
Yeah, it was an interesting story. It was, as a matter of fact, when my brother was making the movie Into the Spear, that he was out speaking to as many people as he could, and a gentleman came in as shared an interest of putting a Bible museum in Dallas, and wanted to know if we would help. And I said, well, if the right opportunity came up, we would consider it. And then they mentioned an artifact that we could buy at a good deal, and that I said we might be willing to buy that for the museum idea that they had. We have a love for the Bible, and the idea was not strange to us. My brother had talked about putting in a Bible museum from time to time throughout the years. So when I offered to potentially acquire that artifact, we started our collection, and never knowing that we would be able to collect as much as we did, as rapidly as we did. But as the collection grew, we just felt the sense of responsibility that maybe we needed to come alongside and make sure that this dream really became a reality.
Well, and again, it's a phenomenal opportunity. I've been to the Museum of the Bible, and I tell everybody that if you go to Washington, D.C., you've got to go there, and don't think that you'll cover it all in an afternoon, right? I mean, I guess that we had that conversation with Lauren the other day. I mean, you could literally spend days there, couldn't you?
That's for sure. They say that if you read everything, you could be there for 9 8-hour days to try to take it all in.
And again, I think you have done such an incredible job. Of course, as I like to say, this is what happens when you have a vision and then you spend $500 million on a museum that's not too far away from a lot of the Smithsonian museums. So make sure that you don't miss those. But Steve, let me talk about that for just a minute, because I'm well aware of the fact that you began to collect some of the artifacts, because before I do this show, I'm actually in the Hope Center, and I'm across the way from where Josh McDowell's ministry was, and sometimes he would have people drop by and show us some of the material that he was interested in, and I know you were interested in. And the bottom line is that because of your interest and because of this availability, you were able to amass an enormous number of great documents, codices, and other things. Can you kind of give us a sense of how many there are? It's probably hard to get a good number, but at least a sense of what we're talking about.
Well, our collection has over 40,000 items in it, and it really started, our first artifact we bought in 2009, and that was really during a time when the economy was struggling and some opportunities were presented. We had a collector that had collected for 30 years that had 10,000 items in his collection, and he sold us his collection. And then, we bought a single item at auction. Cambridge was selling an item because of the struggling economy that they were needing some revenue, and sold it at auction. So everything from a single item at auction to a collection of 10,000 items is how we collected. Our collection grew. But within the museum, we have over 40 individuals, institutions that are a part of what we have on display there. So the resources that we have to tell the Bible story is very broad, and it's exciting to be able to see all of those pieces come together to share this incredible book's story.
Jackie, let's talk about that for just a minute, because I think if people have not been to the museum, they might say, well, it's just going to have a lot of, pictures of, or maybe artifacts of dusty manuscripts, and it's going to probably be boring for everybody except people like Kerby Anderson and maybe seminary students. But you have done an outstanding job of bringing the Bible to life. Can you explain how that is actually achieved in the Museum of the Bible?
I'd love to. First of all, I would like to say that it's very family-friendly, and it's encompassing for everyone of all age groups and abilities to understand what they're looking at. We've made it so friendly for everyone. It has 430,000 square feet, and we have a flyboard theater ride, which is a lot of fun.
Oh, yes.
Takes you throughout D.C., where you will see scripture engraved on monuments. And then we have the New Testament theater, which is very interesting, and the Old Testament Hebrew walkthrough. It's very immersive. It's a very different type of museum, so that you're not just necessarily looking at artifacts under glass. It's a hands-on experience and very visual. And we think we've had a great team that's worked very hard to make it fun for everybody.
Yes. I need to take a break, but let me just mention that, again, sometimes I talk about the Bible through history, and if you love history, that's the case. How we got our Bible. We talk a lot on this program sometimes about Bible translations. There's a whole room that shows some of those that have been translated, others that have not. If you've never been to Israel, and again, we will probably have another Israel tour here at Point of View, you can almost feel like you go back to the ancient town of Nazareth at one point, and we'll explain a little bit more about all the resources that are there, but also just talk about the incredible impact that the Bible has had in the lives of individuals throughout the millennia, but even in the lives of these two individuals. And so Steve and Jackie Green are with us today. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about them, or I'd like to know a little bit more about Hobby Lobby, I'd like to know a little bit more about the Museum of the Bible, or even about this book, again, you can click on some of this. The book has been out for many months, but again, it's available in hardcover, also available in Kindle, and we have some links there, but you probably should be able to find it in your local bookstore. It's published by Zondervan. So we'll continue our conversation with them right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This summer, we will certainly hear that the warmer temperatures demonstrate that we are headed for a climate doomsday. That is why Vijay Jairaj wrote an article with a provocative title, Why Climate Doomsday Won't Happen This Summer. I suppose his predictions could be as accurate as any of the others we've heard. He has 4 points. First, the world just experienced one of its coldest recorded winters in history. Cities like New York registered record snowfall. Many cities in the U.S. and Canada broke 80-year record lows, and even the U.K. experienced snowy conditions well into spring. He is quick to acknowledge that a cold winter doesn't guarantee a mild summer, but he believes that we might at least remind ourselves that global temperatures have not been increasing in the way we've been warned in the media. Second, global average temperature is rising, but it isn't even as close to the rate claimed by climate alarmists. At the very least, it would suggest that the climate computer models are missing key data and information. If the models don't model reality, something must be off. At least that was the conclusion we reached when I was in graduate school doing computer models and simulations. Third, carbon dioxide emissions are not the primary driver of global temperatures. The last 2 decades constituted the highest increase in carbon dioxide, yet the rate of global temperatures was lower than in previous decades. And finally, the Arctic and Antarctic ice masses are stable. Alarmists talk about the Arctic melting because the Antarctic ice mass is increasing. In fact, even the Arctic mass is stable, and it's worth mentioning that the polar bear populations are stable. These are just a few facts to remember the next time you hear someone in the media predicting an imminent climate doomsday. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Steve and Jackie Green, founding family of the Museum of the Bible, and this is a book called This Dangerous Book, How the Bible Has Shaped Our World and Why It Still Matters Today. It is published by Zondervan. Let me just mention that in the middle there are 16 pages of color photographs, so that gives you a sense of not only the Bible but the Museum of the Bible. At the very end, there's about 16 pages of maps, very similar to some that you might find in your Bible with all sorts of specificity. And of course, there's just great videos and all sorts of issues. And Jackie, you know, when people walk in, almost instantaneously they go, whoa, because they look up and there's sort of like the Sistine Chapel, but it's not that. It is actually just an incredible amount of electronics and graphics that change out, and then they are given a device that looks a little bit like a cell phone, but it allows you to kind of program in what you're looking for, what you might be interested in, and it directs you. So people that come into the Museum of the Bible are going to say, this is not like any museum I've ever been in before, don't you think?
I do think, you know, it's a 140-foot long digital screen that changes every minute or so. And it's just beautiful, the graphics that you get to see. Some people just sit right there and look at that for a while because it's breathtaking. But we do have a very electronically savvy museum, and so it's not your typical, as I said, your typical grandmother's museum. I can't say that. I'd say that tongue-in-cheek because I'm a grandmother
That's
now.
your grandmother, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Steve, give us the background story, because a lot of people know, and I think we've talked about this with Lauren before and with Jeremiah Johnston and others, that at one point you thought, well, maybe I'll do a museum in Dallas. I'm so glad you did in Washington, D.C. But again, it's hard to find a building in Washington, D.C. that isn't owned by the government and isn't a Smithsonian museum. So tell us a little bit of that backstory, if you might.
Yeah, well, when we, as I mentioned, the group that we first connected with wanted to put a museum in Dallas, and we're in Oklahoma City, and so that was, it's close, it's nice. I remember the mayor of Oklahoma City called and suggested we put it here, and I said, well, I'd love to for selfish reasons, but I think it needs to be, in a major metropolitan where it'll have the most impact. And so we were looking in Dallas, and after a while, I thought, well, what if God doesn't want it in Dallas? I wanted to open it up. And so when I look at the top 10 metros, the other two that stood out to me were New York City and Washington, D.C. So we engaged a gentleman to look in all three cities to see if there might be a site that would work great for a Bible museum. When we did a survey, and the survey's primary question was, if we build it, will they come? Is there an interest for a Bible museum? And the result of that was that it was overwhelming, that there was over 80% thought it was a good or great idea. But it also showed, the survey also showed that it would be best attended in Washington, D.C. New York City was second, Dallas was third. So it just made sense that we would go where we would be best attended, where museums in our country are congregated, and the largest concentration is the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So we decided, let's focus on D.C., and it was about 18 months after we decided to focus on D.C. when the location we are at came up. And as I understand, since we acquired that building, there's not been another building that large that has come available that close to the mall. So it's an indication in my mind where God was just going before us, and he knew where he wanted us all along, but it took us a little time to get there.
Well, again, Jackie, one of the things I think so nice is on that top floor, you can see the Capitol. And I've noticed that our good friends Greg Laurie and a variety of others, Jack Graham and others, they always get the camera positioned so that they're standing in the Museum of the Bible. You can see the Capitol behind them. And so you've provided a great photo op for almost everybody that ends up in Washington, D.C.
That's right. We have a beautiful view of the Capitol. And at the other end of the museum, you can see the Washington Monument. So it's a fabulous view, but getting that Capitol right there in the background is a great pick. So if you get to go to the museum, make sure you do that.
Well, let's, if we can, for just a minute, come back to the book a little bit, and we talk about the story, but also I'd like to talk about the book. You know, that's a section where you talk about the wonder of the Bible, and the Bible is more than a book. And Steve, can you speak to that for just a minute? Because a lot of people will say, well, it's nice you have a museum of the Bible. We could have a museum of the Bhagavad Gita. We could have a museum of the Quran. Well, no, we believe the Bible is a lot more than just the writings of a few ancients. We believe it's God's revelation. And you really wanted to make sure that people understood that and understood certainly the significance of the Bible, not only in individual lives, but throughout history.
Yeah, I mean, this is not just your usual book like any other book that has an author that has written it, whether it's ancient or recent. This is a unique book. It's a collection of books that have been put together over a long period of time. And when you look at and you think and study, the different authors that wrote it, and you realize they came from different walks of life. They had even spoke different languages. It was written in different languages on different continents. From a king on his throne to a prisoner in prison. And then you realize that there is a story that when you put all these together, that it makes up. It's like that collage of pictures that you see a picture, and then when you back out, you see thousands of pictures that make up another picture. And that, in essence, is what this book is. And the more you analyze how this book came together and what it is and how it tells a larger story of a good creator God that created all things and it was good. And because of our disobedience, he had to send a son to restore the relationship. That is an incredible thought to think about. And we want people just to basically understand there's three ways we look at it. It's history, its impact, and its narrative. What is this book's story, and how did it come together, and how has it impacted our world? Because this is the most incredible book that's ever been put together.
Yes, again, history, impact, and narrative, and that gives you a little bit of an overview of the Museum of the Bible. Let's take a break, though, and we will continue our conversation with Steve and Jackie Green. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Have a lot more to cover, but again, the book is entitled This Dangerous Book, How the Bible Has Shaped Our World and Why It Still Matters Today. Book's been out for a number of months, and so you might be able to find it in your local bookstore. But let me, just as we are going to our break, talk about how I think it's important for you to support this ministry. And Rodney Hare shares a little bit about the impact it had in his life.
It was about 1980 when my wife and I moved from Dallas to Argyle, and we enrolled our kids in the Argyle public schools. Point of View was the catalyst that brought us to the realization that public schools were not an option. They just were not. When I heard Point of View explain about secular humanism, I went to our local public school because that's where my wife Judy and I had our two children. And I learned firsthand that what Point of View was teaching on the radio was something that was totally different than what I had understood was going on in school. It drove us to really begin a school. And that school is now Liberty Christian School in Argyle, Texas. We have a campus of 1,315 children in grades pre-K through 12th grade. Every year we graduate about 110 students. They will go to universities throughout the world. They will gain scholarships in academics and fine arts and athletics. Last year, 102 students received scholarships that totaled about $7.6 million. It was a credit to the Point of View radio station that started us with the beginnings of challenging your kids and teaching them the truth, letting them know what they can do, and encouraging them and loving on them. Our kids are prepared for the major universities through the curriculum and through the teaching of intelligent, motivated teachers. We use curriculum that's Christ-centered. It weaves Christ into the fabric of the information, and it more prepares the kids for any university in the country. Point of View is relevant today because it is still teaching the truth, and it is still current. It stays on point, and it does not waver. They have refused to lower their standards. They have refused to not teach the truth. They're not going to accept lies, and they're going to teach what you need to know about how to raise your children. Without those of us that are able to really help substantially and giving sacrificially, a Point of View will never be as strong as it could be. We cannot let anything happen to Point of View radio.
So again, just some opportunity for you to be involved. And as we come to the end of our fiscal year, which ends this Friday, we certainly do challenge you to consider what you might do to support this ministry so that you can support individuals like this. And we've already had a chance today to hear from Vicki Garza talk about what they do on campus, Michelle Bachman going into the political arena, Rodney Hare starting a school. Your gift makes a difference. And so help us if you can by going to the website, pointofview.net. Click on the button that says donate. Or, of course, even as we go to a break here, this would be a great time for you to call the pledge line. That is 800-347-5151. We need your financial support, and we need to end the fiscal year in the black, so any help you can give would be greatly appreciated. We'll be right back.
Ronnie fixes cars in a shop on his property. That allows him to earn a living for his family and be home to help care for Michael. Ronnie and Judy adopted Michael more than 20 years ago, knowing he would never walk or be able to care for himself. But through listening to Point of View, they were convicted that every life God gives is precious. So even though Ronnie is now 69 and Judy can't lift Michael anymore, every day is a labor of love and a testimony to their faith. Providing for their family isn't easy, and yet every month for almost 15 years, they've invested in Point of View. Some listeners have changed their communities and the nation. Ronnie and Judy changed everything for Michael. Your gift to Point of View in June is an investment in changed lives, and a matching challenge provides double the impact if you give in the next few days. Please give now, 1-800-347-5151, or visit pointofview.net. Make a difference for the future. That future is now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Talking about the Bible, and if you'd like to join the conversation on air, 1-800-351-1212. This Dangerous Book, How the Bible Has Shaped Our World and Why It Still Matters Today. Steve and Jackie Green with us for a little bit longer. And Steve, just before we get back to the book, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about religious liberty for just a moment. A little bit later, we're going to hear from Kelly Shackelford and the impact Point of View has had in his life at First Liberty. But we already, of course, talked about how the Hobby Lobby case was at least somewhat indirectly involved in the case of Masterpiece Cake Shop. which involved Jack Phillips in Colorado. Today, of course, the Supreme Court has also ruled by vacating the ruling against Baronelle Stutzman, who was the florist in Washington State. And so it is amazing as I've looked at some of these Supreme Court decisions. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play a lawyer on television, but we have lawyers around the table all the time. But when I do read some of these, it's amazing how many times they refer back to the Hobby Lobby case. And I've asked your dad this. I thought I'd ask you too. Did you ever anticipate that you were going to be one of the fundamental kind of landmark cases on the Supreme Court dealing with religious liberty that even today we are still talking about?
No, that would have been the last thing that we've imagined. And, of course, I guess anybody that is a part of a landmark would say the same thing, but would, never thought that in America we would be a part of having to defend our own religious freedom, but we were.
And again, I just appreciate you standing strong on that issue of abortifacients and a number of others. Our own ministry here benefited from that, and I know other ministries have. So, again, I know that sometimes whether it's Chick-fil-A or Hobby Lobby or a variety of others, sometimes they get criticized by the world, but we certainly appreciate the stand that Hobby Lobby has taken over the years, and I think for many years we'll still keep referring back to that decision that came down on Hobby Lobby. But let's get back to the book for just a minute, because one of the things that you have also done is by collecting these manuscripts, given us, I think, a greater confidence that we have the Word of God. We talked about certainly the narrative of the Bible. We've talked about the impact of the Bible. We've talked about the history of the Bible. But another issue is the transmission of the Bible. Most people don't realize that, and you've had a chance to hold in your hands some of these ancient manuscripts, and that should inspire us to have even greater confidence that we have the Word of God.
Well, and that is what we would like to show and let people understand about the history of this book. Is there is more manuscript evidence, for example, for the New Testament than all the major classical works combined. And there are those that would believe that the Bible is just a fairy tale, a novel that somebody made up. And yet, what we want to do is we want to present the evidence. We don't cross a line and tell people it is true. Our role is just to let people know the evidence, educate them on the evidence, show the manuscript evidence for it, and make their own decision on what they do with it. The evidence is just so overwhelming for those that are willing to look into it. There are people like Josh McDowell you mentioned that was atheistic and was going to try to prove Scripture wrong. And when you look into it, the evidence, as his great book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, forces people to say, there is just overwhelming evidence. I have got to decide, what am I going to do with this evidence? And that's kind of the role that we play, is we just want to present the evidence and let the visitor decide what they do with it.
Well, again, we've been talking about religious liberty, but of course you have a section there about history, and you've got Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church in New London, and all sorts of other aspects. And Jackie, let me come to you. I know you're going to have to leave pretty soon, but talk about some of the history, because I'm concerned today that our children, and especially I have a grandchild as well, our grandchildren are not learning the history that maybe we learned, or maybe even your father-in-law learned in school. And this is a place where you can really maybe fill in some of those educational gaps at the Museum of the Bible, don't you think?
I do, and I'm convinced in looking at some of the history books that our kids are using today in their schools, that some of history has been removed from the books that we even had when we were kids in school. And so that's a concern to me. And I feel like as parents, it's important for us to take our kids to learn what those gaps are and become familiar with them and see the biblical perspective of our nation's history, which is pretty incredible.
And again, they don't have to just stand there and read things, although there's a lot to read. They can stand there and watch and listen too, can't they? Because there's a lot of audiovisual opportunities, especially in that history section, I thought.
Yes, there is a lot. And we have the Dave Stott drive-through history. We have several of those videos that they can stop and sit and watch the video. And then We have a theater that shows him driving in his car, in different countries, showing the transmission of the Bible. And then we also have, like I mentioned before, we have the New Testament theater. We have the theater and the Hebrew walkthrough, which is a big favorite of people and goes through the whole Old Testament. And then they love that flyboard theater ride that takes them through D.C. to see the scripture engraved on the monuments. But, it's just very experiential. There's a lot to see. There are screens that you can take a little quiz, and you can record your story in the Joshua machine of what the Bible means to you. When we're talking about the Bible being we have access to this Bible. It's the most best-selling book of all time. And it's so accessible for us, and we sort of take advantage of that. We don't stop and take the time to learn more about it. But it's the best-selling book of all time year after year. And so we think it's important for people to have the ability to learn more about it.
And just before I let you go, of course, I'll keep Steve here. Talk about walking through Nazareth, because a lot of our listeners say, I'd love to go to Israel. Don't know that I'm ever going to make it there. And even if I do, I'm not really going to get a sense of what it was like when Jesus lived in Nazareth, or when Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, or when Jesus was in Jerusalem. But you've done a phenomenal job, I think, of recreating kind of an ancient city in the midst of the museum, which I think would have surprised almost anybody.
Right. It is a great replication of what Jesus' Nazareth would have looked like. We have a mikveh, we have a temple, we have some wonderful docents that will be there and answer your questions and tell you about their life there in Nazareth. And so it's a great opportunity to see Nazareth if you're never going to get to go. And even if you have been, you will walk in there and you'll see that it looks very familiar. And it's a favorite of a lot of people that come through the museum.
Well, let me, just before we take another break, ask you, Steve, where we go from here, because I certainly would encourage people to visit the museum, but this is not just a static museum, as I understand it. Even when I've either been there or I've been on the website, I get the sense that there are other exhibits coming through, and you have some other kind of plans for the future. Can you kind of help us understand what those might be?
Yes, we have a temporary exhibit space. It's divided when we first opened into 3 different spaces. We're changing it now. We have some temporary exhibit space up on the 5th level as well. So the idea is that we really literally scratch the surface of the Bible story, because there is no building that can contain this book story. And that's where the temporary exhibits give us the ability to do a deeper dive. And we're constantly going to be telling different stories. It may be there 6 months to a year, and then it will change out. We're working on a Billy Graham exhibit, for example. So we want people to realize that there's always something new that they're going to want to come back and check out when they're in D.C. again.
Well, again, lots of great resources. Let me take a break, and when we come back, if you have any comments or questions, maybe you've been to the museum or you have a question about it, I want to leave this last segment open to you. 1-800-351-1212. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about this book. This, first of all, would be just a great story about the Bible, but I might just alert those of you that are Bible teachers, you can actually use this. I've taken the pictures that I've taken at the Museum of the Bible and used that for a Sunday school lesson. But you don't even have to be there, because, first of all, there's a lot of pictures online. There are 16 pages of color pictures here, and you could really use this to talk about the significance of the Bible and what we have learned in terms of the impact of the Bible, its narrative aspects. Of course, Jackie mentioned the idea of driving through the Bible. That's a great resource as well. It takes archaeology and makes it a lot more relevant. So we'll come back and talk for just another minute or two about how you could use some of these resources that are available, and how, again, if you visit the Museum of the Bible, what to expect, and if this book would be something that you would want to use in your own personal reading or study or teaching, let me encourage you to do so. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about how to use the resources that are available. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And before we end today, we'll again talk about how you can support this ministry as we come to the end of our fiscal year. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Steve Green right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1925, the Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial was erected to honor the 49 men of Prince George's County, Maryland, who gave their lives in World War I. It stands outside of Washington, D.C. in the median near the National Defense Highway. This memorial, one of the oldest memorials on U.S. soil to honor the fallen of World War I, has stood without complaint for nearly a century. For the first time in over 9 decades, the American Humanist Association voiced a complaint. They filed a federal lawsuit seeking to topple the memorial because those who erected it chose the shape of a cross to honor the fallen. One of the mothers who supported the memorial early on noted to her senator that her son died and was buried in Europe. Though she could not visit his grave there, she said, she considered the Bladensburg World War I memorial to be her son's grave marker close to home. First Liberty Institute, along with our volunteer attorneys at the law firm of Jones Day, represents the American Legion who erected the memorial in 1925. This memorial was erected to honor heroes who gave their lives in defense of freedom. To tear this memorial down now would not only desecrate their memory, it would demonstrate a level of hostility to religion that our founding fathers warned against. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
This dangerous book written by Steve and Jackie Green, How the Bible Has Shaped Our History and Why It Still Matters Today. And Steve, for just a minute, let's talk about some of the history, because you talk about the fact that the Bible was instrumental in the founding of this country. You have the New England Primer. You have, of course, the Westminster Shorter Catechism. You can move from the 16th century to the 17th century in the American Revolution. You can move to the 19th century. You have John Quincy Adams and Amistad, which is a section in the book. And really, there's a summary there that you have from Time Magazine where there's about 150 turning points in history. I was struck by how many turning points in history were either directly or indirectly influenced by the Bible. So for a person today to say, well, I don't need to read the Bible's just ancient literature, it's not significant. The level of Bible illiteracy today has really hurt our culture, and I don't see how you could be educated if you didn't take the time to read the Bible. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that list really came from some lists from secular publications that were just indicating here are different turning points throughout history or the world, and one that sticks out in my mind was in the year 2000, Life magazine came out with a publication of the 100 most important events or people of a millennium. Mm-hmm. So for 1,000 years, the most important events, and number one on their list was Gutenberg prints the Bible.
Yes.
And what they're saying is that one event had more impact than any other event for 1,000 years, and in essence, it changed our world. And it wasn't the Gutenberg press; it was Gutenberg prints the Bible. And so, for us not to know this book just doesn't make sense. Even Richard Dawkins, who is an avid atheist and has a best-selling book called God Delusion. He argues in his book that the Bible ought to be part of our education simply because of how it's impacted our language. And he gives over 100 examples of phrases in our vernacular that come from the King James Version of the Bible. An example is a Good Samaritan. How many times have you heard a news story where somebody acted as a Good Samaritan? Well, if you don't know that story, then you just lost the context of that news story and become a bit illiterate in our culture. And that's what Richard Dawkins' point is that we ought to know this book, and we just think people ought to know it, and that's what we're trying to do at the museum, is educate people about this book that's changed our world.
Just before we go, let's talk about how some of our listeners can use the book. Now, it's just a wonderful book just to read in a devotional sense, and it will certainly encourage your faith and commitment to biblical ideas and to the Bible itself. But we do have, Steve, a number of listeners that are pastors, they're Sunday school teachers, they're small group leaders. It seems to me that this book, published by Zondervan, that is available in almost every bookstore, and certainly we have some links on our website to it as well, could be a great opportunity to teach some people who think they know a lot about the Bible, learn some other very important elements of that. So have you thought about how individuals could use this in a teaching format?
Well, I think that what we do in the book is we kind of tell three different stories. One is just the Bible story at a very high level. And I think it's very important for especially a new believer or somebody that doesn't know the Bible, before they ever dig into the weeds, they really need to have a good understanding of the overall story of what the Bible is. And we kind of, throughout the Scripture, just talk about the Bible story. And then we talk about how that it's impacted our life, and this can be applicable to people, what does this story mean? And we just tell how it has impacted our lives as Jackie and I have grown up and having a love and being taught the Bible. And then we talk about the Museum of the Bible and how we got started on that journey. So there's different ways that it could be used, and hopefully be inspiring for people to ultimately get to know the Bible better.
Well, again, just a great resource. And let me just say, we've enjoyed having your dad, David Green, on talking about giving it all away and getting it back again. Of course, Lauren has been on with us both by phone and even in studio. And we want to use her more when we can on our Millennial Roundtable on Only One Life, How a Woman's Every Day Shapes an Eternal Legacy, that you wrote with your wife. And Steve, it's just been great to have you on the program as well.
Hey, we appreciate you having us, Kerby. It's been a pleasure and honor for us.
Well, again, we look forward to the next opportunity to interact with any of the Green family. And so, again, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You bet. Thank you, Kerby.
Just before we run out of time, let me mention that we are coming down to the end of our fiscal year, and I just thought it would be a great opportunity for us to look back over some of these issues. And today, as we talked with Steve Green just briefly about this issue of religious liberty, would probably never have imagined, as he said, that they would be a landmark case. But as we're talking about religious liberty, as we're talking about the Supreme Court even today vacating this decision that came down against Barronelle Stutzman, and it'll probably come back to the court again. And of course, we have some other cases that are going to issue the issue of religious liberty. I thought it'd be good to hear from Kelly Shackelford. He is, of course, our guest on Friday. Will be with us on this Friday as we talk about the religious liberty issue, and joins us on that roundtable to talk about that. But it was Kelly Shackelford many years ago, hearing about Point of View, that got him thinking about doing what he today is doing.
When I was in college, when I was in law school, you just didn't hear people talking about current issues and actually applying a Christian worldview. I think it's really important to get young people early on to start thinking about things not only analytically, but analytically with a Christian eye and with the Christian worldview. And most young people, especially most college or law students or whatever, aren't trained to think that way. And so to have something every day that is causing you to think and analyze and look at things always through that Christian lens, the things that we are fighting today, having to literally even defend churches. 23 years ago when I started doing this, we would never have to represent a church. That would have been a joke, the idea that we have to represent a church. Now, every week, we have to represent another church. The things that we are fighting for now, I think, certainly the founders would have never conceived, but I don't think any of us, even 20 years ago, could ever conceive. So we have got to take this country back. We've got to take these freedoms back and get ourselves back to the country that our founders put in place, where religious freedom is the first freedom that really provides a birth for all freedom that we have in this country.
Kelly Shackelford. I remember Diane talking about the fact that she used to listen to Point of View many years ago, and then when her husband moved to the Washington, D.C. area, again, sponsored Point of View on that station, and then was asked by the station to host her own radio program that came on kind of during the breaks, and that became the number 2 program on the station. And again, just was so thankful that Point of View was educating her and keeping us informed. And of course, earlier we talked about the influence that it not only had on Michelle Bachmann and Rodney Hare and Vicky Garza, but of course you just now heard from Kelly Shackelford. And when you give to Point of View, you give to help those individuals become the salt of the earth and the light of the world. You help them begin to understand how important it is to be involved, and we educate them, we empower them, and we really equip them to make a difference in their community. So your gift will certainly be used to advance this next generation of Kelly Shackelfords and Michelle Bachmann. So anything you can do to help us out financially, especially as we come to the end of our fiscal year, that number, again, that you can call for the pledge line number is 800-347-5151. I've seen some that have already been willing to give a one-time gift, and if you would want to do that, we would greatly appreciate it. We'll leave it to you to decide what the size might be. Some of you might also want to join with us on a monthly basis, become part of our Truth Team for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. You can be part of that team as well. Whatever you decide, we'll leave that to you, but we certainly would love to hear from you. Again, 800-347-5151. Of course, you can also find out more about not only giving to this ministry, but about the books that we've talked about today, the Larry Elder book and the Steve and Jackie Green book. All of that is available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress, but thankfully, Don Blythe had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.